The topic is about cognitive load. Okay, so I guess that part you already got it from the invite, and I'm guessing that's also why you are interested to participate. And it's about cognitive load in large organizations. So let me first touch upon what the heck is cognitive load. And so that might be actually something that you hear here and there, but it's important actually to understand the concept properly, because the first thing what we notice a lot is a misunderstanding what it actually is. And so to put it simply, I'm not a psychologist or something like that, but this part I do understand, and I'm going to explain in a very simple terms. So essentially, we have something called working memory and a permanent memory. So we shouldn't be confusing the two. So working memory is something with a very limited capacity. And so this means, for example, if somebody lays out for you 7 or more numbers, then we are very likely unable to recall basically what the first numbers already are. We start to forget the first numbers already. And so this is a very simple small test to kind of show you what working memory actually is. So if I name the random numbers, bunch of them, then essentially already after 3-4 numbers, after naming them, we already a little bit start to forget the first numbers. Now, the longer you mention other numbers, the sooner you fill up your basically cognitive load and your memory, and then you need to offload basically the first numbers automatically. So it means that you can't really recall all those numbers unless you do some trickery, which actually puts that in a permanent memory somewhat, and then you can try to recall. But without trickery, you're going to forget those numbers. So it's extremely limited in a capacity, actually. And so this is not to confuse with permanent memory. Many people confuse that. And in explaining when they say, oh, I need to know so much, I'm cognitively overloaded. That doesn't make much sense, actually. Now, there are 3 kinds of cognitive load, and this is going to be quite important in product development. So intrinsic cognitive load is the effort, for example, needed to change the product. So if you need to change something. And so meaning that you have in front of you, for example, piece of code, and the effort it takes to actually make that change in that code. Now, if the code is very cumbersome and difficult to deal with, then it's going to take more effort, etc. Or if it doesn't have a test, for example, then it's going to be quite difficult to deal with. Then I have a second one, extraneous cognitive load. The effort needed to read and understand what to change in a product, as an example, okay? Or just simply understand from somebody else when they explain the requirements. So you need to put an effort to actually understand what we're supposed to do. And the last one is germane cognitive load, is the effort needed to develop permanent knowledge. In other words, effort required to learn something. So not a fact of amount of knowledge that you have, but the act of learning to acquire that knowledge. That's basically what it refers to. Now, I on purpose put the first 2 as red and the last one as green. Why? Because in general sense, in product development, you want to reduce as much as possible the first 2. And so don't have that essentially. And the third one, you want to actually optimize. So you don't want to get rid of it. This simply means effort to do learning. So the more you learn, the more expertise you build up. Okay, so also germane cognitive load leads to lots of advantages over time, while the first 2 don't have actually any advantage over time. So it's just cumbersome, remains to be cumbersome without advantage of putting that effort to actually go through the cognitive load. So keep that in mind. This kind of a distinction, that germane cognitive load is actually quite useful something. So when you look at also science and scientists being busy with this topic, they basically mainly focus on how to, they mainly talk about cognitive load in the context of learning, and therefore how to actually effectively learn. And so adopting all kinds of practices to advance techniques to acquire knowledge. Now let's take that extraneous cognitive load. So how does it manifest itself in a product development? So I'm going to connect immediately to product development, what it actually means. So let me just go back. Extraneous cognitive load is the effort to read and understand what to change in a product. Now, we need to make a distinction between presentation of information, presentation of a task. So for now, I'm not going to talk about much of presentation of information because it's a very different dynamic than a presentation of a task. So so what we see in, if you kind of make it a bit black-white, the distinction between in different companies is a different situation. Some companies put heavily on emphasis on a team members just simply executing the task and focusing on that. And so this means there is a somebody else who's actually doing discovery process and figuring out actually what needs to be done, and then just simply creates a task, a Jira task, or whatever you want to call it, and assigns to a developer or team member, and they just simply execute. Now, a disadvantage of that is that there is a high extraneous cognitive load. So you're basically constantly putting effort to understand what this task actually is. But on the other hand, there's a low germane cognitive load. So it doesn't take much effort to actually comprehend the context, learn about it, etc. You just need to understand what that task is that you actually work on. Okay, so this is what happens when you're just simply task-oriented. And but then we also know, and especially in agile world today and in advancement, that we generally don't want people just to execute tasks, but also really understand the customer context and problem space, etc. So this means that basically this presentation of a task is not really done by somebody else. It's actually done by developers themselves, by the team themselves. They define the tasks. And what they do receive is they receive information. They receive customer problem and they listen to that. And then based on what they see and learn, essentially they predominantly act in a process of learning. They define which tasks should be executed essentially. So it's a very different dynamic. So in that dynamic, there is a low extraneous cognitive load. Why? Because they define their own tasks. There is no separate party which is actually presenting the task to them for them to be executed. But there's a high germane cognitive load because this means they need to engage with the customer, with the experts to understand, to explore the context and to understand the bigger picture, etc. And so this means, but also this leads obviously to a lot of learning. Okay, so in the beginning, they might feel, oh, I need to put so much effort to understand all of this. But over time, they learn, acquire expertise, and this leads to all kinds of advantages. Okay, this is one of the fundamental aspects to understand about it. Then, to continue, there are some certain beliefs which are very common regarding the cognitive load, and now I understand some basics about it. So the one belief, and actually myth, is that teams are cognitively overloaded because they must know so much about components to properly maintain them. And so you can replace components with all kinds of things. They need to know so much about other parts of organization, so much about this, so much about that. And so they cannot possibly engage with that because there is too much to handle, they say. And as I just pointed out, cognitive load has nothing to do with that. And so the fact that you have a lot to do is unrelated to the cognitive load. And so this is often used as a misconception, which leads to all kinds of unwanted effects because of this misunderstanding of actually what cognitive load is. And so we need to actually explore what exactly is happening here and what do we mean by this kind of statements. But in any case, it has nothing to do with the cognitive load. Okay. Second one, belief a team feels cognitively overloaded if they have too many responsibilities to handle. It's basically the same thing. Yeah. So this one is even funnier. I will show you that if the team has a limited responsibility, they are more likely to be cognitively overloaded than if they have a lot of responsibility. Okay. So it's actually product development, a limited responsibility leads to cognitive overload than a lot of responsibility. Second one, third one is belief, let developers do only development and maybe testing for better focus. This one also if you let developers only do this part of the responsibility, they actually will have less focus, not more focus. That's the funny part. And so it's a very widespread something which seems common sense, turns out to be in reality very, very different. And after doing 25 years of product development, seeing so many groups, in the beginning I thought the same, but over time I noticed something really interesting, that exactly opposite situations. In some companies which struggle with this, with a massive amount of work and teams complaining, those teams don't actually have much responsibilities in the first place. And then I encounter other companies where I see that they have a massive amount of responsibility, these teams, and they really engage end to end in coordination and everything, taking care of many systems, etc. And they don't even talk about that problem. So that's kind of fascinating. How is it possible that this is actually not even present as a problem? And so it made me think and observe way more and realize at some point what's actually going on. And I'm going to explain what's actually going on. Now, in order to understand that, we need to look things from a more holistic point of view, organizational setup within which these teams actually are working. Now, I'm going to first, to keep things not too complicated and chaotic, explain you two patterns. Obviously, there's all kinds of variations of these patterns, but to keep things simple, they are explaining two patterns. One pattern is where the teams are organized in such a way that the teams have the autonomy in building. It means that they have ownership of a certain parts of the landscape. So they own certain components, and other team owns other components, and there is no shared ownership essentially. Okay, so each team owns their own part, and if you want to get work done in any of the components, it has to go to the team essentially. That's the bottom line. Okay, now what happens in that case is that you have a high customer cross-team dependence. So the more each team owns one part, the more segregated your landscape will be between different teams. The more likely you're going to have a dependency between different teams. Okay. Simply because it's the likelihood of one need from a customer to fit within the responsibility of one team is low, because simply imagine that you have 50 teams. The need typically doesn't fit in a box of one team. Okay, so therefore you need a structures pretty much always on top of the teams to manage that. So there is a project management, program management, train engineers, PI plannings, architecture runways, and so on and so on. It's just endless need for this kind of stuff, and that must be there. Simply, if you have such a structure, you have to have. If you have such teams, you have to have a structure on top of that in order to manage that. Okay. And now, second pattern is the one. So just to go back to this one, there's a low technical dependence. Why? Because each component is basically they can do independently. If something needs to be done in these components, that team can do independently. So they are autonomous in that regard. Okay. Now, second pattern is exactly opposite, which basically says there is a very high autonomy in solving customer problem. This means whatever problem they actually pick up, regardless of the components that need to be changed, that team has a full autonomy to solve the problem. So this means there is a low dependence between teams in delivering and solving the customer problem. So there's no waiting on each other to get stuff done, because one team can basically done all the parts and deliver it end to end essentially. So the delivery time is way faster, but then you have a high technical interdependence. So teams depend on each other heavily in making sure that they're basically sharing the ownership for the components. So multiple teams are going to share the same, going to change the same components. Okay. So the consequence here is that you actually constantly need to align and ensure that the stuff is done properly. And so the quality and practices regarding that I will mention later on. Okay. Okay. So these are basically kind of like two basic patterns. Now let's explore a bit more. So I will just give you a bit of idea. Another one is if you have everything is a project, so meaning that the people are actually temporarily assigned to the project and then they're dismantled once the project is finished. So what you have is low autonomy solving customer problem. Why? Because they're basically dealing with the projects and executing tasks of a project. This kind of a they're not dealing directly with the customer, and low autonomy in building. This is just bad and bad. So there is no compromise, just bad on both sides. And so typical teams are also badly performing because they are temporary resources, essentially. So it takes time for teams to actually gel and figure out practices, etc. So this is, in general, just kind of like a worse situation that you can have when it comes to this dynamic. Then it has a typically contract game structure to make things even worse when it comes to that. And so it becomes a tension, like how come you're delivering so badly, blah, 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 blah. Now, next one is fixed teams in departments. This is nowadays very common, especially in the banking, where you have teams which are working from the fixed departments, and they typically also own certain components there, applications, whatever you want to call it. And then you have a project on top of that, which manage across different groups. So in this case, you have a low autonomy solving custom problem, because that's basically, yeah, those projects, project management, etc., do that, or people outside. And then the teams are just getting the tasks to accomplish whatever is being figured out up here. And delivery, but then they have a high autonomy building, as I mentioned. So slow delivery and a lot of dependencies. This is actually then the consequence that you have. So it takes time to get something done because it's crossing multiple teams, need to wait on each other, etc. Okay, next one. You have a bunch of people in different functional departments, and they are basically rented out to a project. And those projects then themselves, those people, those teams might have a high autonomy solving customer problem, but then they have a very low autonomy building. And why? Because they basically need to deliver whatever is required for this project. But then the really bad part is they are not really responsible for maintenance, because once project is finished, they go back to the original departments and you have a maintenance hell. Okay, so not a good idea. Despite they are basically customer-centric, the sustainability becomes problematic. Isolated group. So you mean you have one group which is sharing the ownership, and they're very customer-centric, and they have a high autonomy in solving specific customer problems. So or a certain part of a customer problems, but not the rest. So they're kind of a constraint and limited in their ability, because the rest of the organization doesn't work like that. They are working in a project mode or whatever you want to call it. And so they have a high autonomy in building also, except between other teams in the same group, meaning that they need to align across themselves to ensure that things are done in a consistent way, etc., etc. And but then they have a dependency held with the teams outside of the group. So anything that happens that needs to be done in coordination with other teams becomes a lots of effort to wait and request and done, etc. And so that needs to be then managed still, essentially. Yeah, typically, and on top, you still have a kind of project management, etc., etc. Now comes the most now modern typical way, which is where you seek alignment between business lines and the teams. So you have a certain business lines, and each business line has a bunch of teams, and then they own components. So in this case, basically, it looks like a problem is solved. And the thing is that in this case, because these teams are fixed in a small groups, even if those in that alignment is customer centric, meaning that those teams are actually looking across multiple components and functions, so they're really cross-functional across component, they're basically still limited to the one part of the whole range of all features and capabilities of the product for the execution to deliver something. So they have a still low autonomy in solving customer problem. Why? Because they have autonomy only for the part that they're actually responsible for when it comes to customer problem. So imagine that you have a website and one team is responsible only for I don't know, for the entry to the website, for the what's presented and on, let's say, catalog of the products that you're selling. And but the thing is, when you look at the customer experience, it never limits itself to one piece. It's customer experience typically is a very messy thing. It needs to cross-cut many parts of the product. And so who's taking care of that? Now you still then end up with lots of people on top, which actually need to coordinate and figure it out. This is then typically called product management unit, which is then having designers and prototype people, etc., etc. So you're basically not really much different. And so you still have this complexity of managing things. You do have a high autonomy in building, as I explained before, because they own those components down below. Now, so delivery is still slow unless the features fit within a responsibility of a single team. Now, experience learns that this doesn't happen. In fact, when that happens, it's not a very valuable thing, because a real impact for a customer typically happens when you're crossing multiple capabilities of a product, when you want to actually make sure that the full user experience is substantially better. Those are typically very valuable things for the customer. Now, now we're going to dive deeper, and I hope you can actually follow with me. It's a bit requires a bit more brain effort to follow what is being explained. This is system modeling, so from a systems thinking, and the one thing we need to understand is that if you have a limited responsibility, whether it's a component responsibility or value stream, it doesn't actually matter much in this context. So if the ownership is narrow, this leads to higher. The more narrow it is, the less ability to work on the highest customer value. Why? Because imagine that you have 20 teams, and each team is owning one piece of capability of the product for a long period of time. But at any point in time, what's most important to the customer is not of the same importance across all teams and all capabilities. What's most important changes all the time. So at any point in time, the customer wants, the most important for the customer is typically limited to the work of or one or a few teams out of 20. And the rest of the teams are actually working on the less important stuff, okay? That's simply a logical fact that the need of the customer doesn't follow your structure. And so what's really priority of the company doesn't follow your structure, your fixed structure. And therefore, the teams, so what would happen in that case is that then ideally, teams who are not working on the most important shouldn't be doing anything, okay? So, but this means that at any point in time, only few teams are utilized. Now, no manager ever will accept that only few teams are utilized working on the most important. So what do companies do? They start many projects. Whether they are important or not, it doesn't really matter that much anymore, because they optimize to utilize the teams. And why they do that is because teams are specialized. And they specialize in a certain type of a feature, or they specialized in a certain technology. This is the same problem. And so in order to utilize them, they start many projects. So quite often I hear Agile coaches included, they say, you know what? So I see my management starting so many projects, and so everybody's so overwhelmed in managing those projects. Why they need to start so many projects? Well, the reason is the structure. They don't actually have a choice. Even if they want to just focus on the most important, it's just simply organization is not made to actually deal with that. Okay. And yeah, so if you reduce the ownership of duration of the component ownership, so meaning that the people can shift the ownership, this obviously increases the ability to work on the highest value. So this means if people are able somehow to actually shift what they're working on, then enables organization to basically be more flexible with resourcing for doing the most important work. Okay. Now I'm gonna go even deeper. Given that, so this limited scope also leads to higher cognitive load. Now, how come? Let me explain that. So you have a narrow ownership, okay? This narrow ownership leads to increase of number of teams required to deliver complete value. I already mentioned that. So the more narrow the ownership is, the more teams you require actually to deliver a value. Why? Because the total chain of what needs to be done is split across many teams. So and because you essentially have to utilize people, you need to start many projects. It means also that the teams individually needs to constantly switch context between projects, because one team is working on the most important, but then they actually, to continue, need to wait for another team. And so what are we going to do in the meantime? So they switch to another project. And then some later time, this other team is going to come back to them, say, you need to continue or help us or whatever it is, coordinate. And so they need to switch back to that. And switching back and forth in order to actually keep themselves utilized and still have a progress in the projects. Okay, so you end up with a juggling between different tasks and priorities. And this have a heavy load, pushes the cognitive load up quite a lot. Okay. And and this one I already mentioned, so essentially it's part of that. So the narrow ownership leads to a number of simultaneous initiatives to utilize teams. Okay. Now, even further, I hope you're still not overstretching your cognitive load in following what these pictures. And so given that you have many simultaneous projects requiring multiple teams, what happens on a stakeholder side is that the stakeholders know that. They know there's many projects, but each of them is interested in their project. So what do? They compete between the initiatives for resources. So they start to actually push their initiative at cost of basically others. So they start pushing, I want more, I want more, I want more. Even if they don't need to, they actually incentivize to do that, because if they don't do that, it's going to be at cost of their own initiative. So they want to look like their initiative is really important, everybody. So it seems like you have a lots of very important work, but actually what happens in the background, the stakeholders know they are more competing than they're necessarily thinking that their work is really important. And so this leads to actually need to manage the stakeholders. So suddenly we have a full-time roles just managing the stakeholders. So so-called product owners nowadays, they almost entirely just managing the stakeholders, often what I observe. And but if you think about it, why the heck we even need to manage the stakeholders? That's actually a bit crazy. And this need to actually is purely coming from the waste. There shouldn't be need to manage stakeholders. And also what leads to, because of this competition behavior, to the product backlog size grows. So each team suddenly has a larger and larger product backlog, because what teams do to accommodate this is just they say, let me put it in a backlog and see what happens. Nothing special happens except that you're managing the large backlog and you have a feeling that you have so much work to do, basically. Okay. So the whole system gets incentivized to just create more and more work, essentially, and keep managing that. Now, this competition then leads obviously to context switching, leading to lots of cognitive load, and especially if you need to manage the stakeholders, etc. And then what happens, and now this is the interesting part, is that because of this context switching becomes so high, and the pressure from different stakeholders becomes so high, the team becomes to divide work within each team. They start to divide work between team members. So teams stop actually working as a real teams. So what happens at the beginning of the sprint, they basically assign stories to each individual. And Jira loves that. He can do that, etc. And each individual start to work on their own work, and they're not really working as a team anymore. So each become responsible for one thing. The reason why they do that is not because they don't want to be as a team, but they're simply optimizing to limit the cognitive load. So by having individual task ownership and specialization, it reduces the cognitive load on individual local basis. Okay, so each of them individually now can handle better. But just imagine that you have 5 stakeholders, and all 5 want 5 different things, and you need to work as a one team on 5 different things within the same sprint. Well, good luck with the focus. It's a mess. So so that's why they split between 5, 6 people, and they say each of you work on one thing. Now at least each individually can focus. Okay. Now, as you can imagine, the more they are getting specialized technically, etc., the bigger the distance becomes from the customer, because they are really just focusing locally on that task of a one stakeholder, etc. And the bigger picture is a bit lost essentially for them individually as a team. Okay. Now, what also happens is if you need to is that the number of teams if the number of teams or people available for the most critical initiatives goes down. Okay, so if it's low, then it means that the need to manage and change resourcing goes up. So it's opposite relationship and causal relationship. So so you don't have people are highly specialized, and the more they specialize, the more you need to then re-resource them essentially, repurpose the people, etc. Because over specialization leads to inability to actually work on the most important. So organizations start to be forced to start moving people around. So they start moving people between teams, which actually increases the cognitive load for the people. And because they suddenly need to adjust to a completely different way of working, blah, 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 all these kind of things. But what's even worse happens often is suddenly we have this so-called fractional engineers. Is a term I learned from an American. I love the term. So where the engineer participates in multiple projects. Okay, we need to understand where this comes from. We all agree that it's actually really bad practice, but we have to understand where this comes from. And so the management has a clear need to do that, which I just explained. And and this obviously massively increases the cognitive load. It's a horrible. Yeah. Okay. Now, narrow ownership also leads to reduced focus, funny enough. So the more narrow you actually look at things, as I just explained, the complexity of managing projects across teams is exploding with all these many projects actually and tasks coming to people, etc., which actually leading to less focus. Yeah. So in theory, they think by narrowing my focus, I can focus on only thing. But in reality, they're basically sucked into switching between different things, which is a real thing in a cognitive load. The more you end up in a context switching, the higher the cognitive load. This actually is one of the major focus in product development, major causes of high cognitive load in product development, context switching. And so the only part which you're focusing on is that you're focusing on maybe the same piece of code, but the code is not only part of your work. It's basically all those aspects that actually lead to the change of that code. It's also involved. And a typical one is also being dragged in all kinds of meetings. So developer then complain, I have too many meetings, but we have to understand where these meetings come from, as I just explained. And so to constantly get involved in all kinds of discussions, etc. Now, you have if you have a larger scope of ownership, so each team looks at things from a broader and broader point of view. That means that also opportunity to expand knowledge are bigger, obviously, right? So you can see it positively or negatively. And so negatively seen is I need to learn more. Okay, I need to spend time and learn more. But it means also you have a more chance to learn new things. Yeah, it's the way you want to look at it. And it also means that a number of people sharing insights and ideas with each other is larger. Because for the two people to actually exchange ideas and about how to do certain things, they have to have an overlap in the knowledge. Understand? So if they don't have an overlap in knowledge, they can't really exchange ideas because they don't know from each other context within which actually the idea would play out. For example, you cannot go to a doctor and have a brilliant idea how to do their job if you're not a doctor yourself. Okay, so and vice versa, a doctor who doesn't know software development, it's difficult to have a brilliant idea how to do software development differently. So So then the more overlap of knowledge and the context they understand, the higher the chance of new discoveries in innovation. Okay, so because more people are engaged and more people have ideas, more brains playing with each other, etc. Okay. Now, but some would say, but what about the Conway's Law? Okay, so Conway's Law has showed us if we align our architecture according to the business need as we have, and also the team structure should be aligned according to the wanted architecture, then everything kind of should flow automatically, and we shouldn't have all this messiness. We should have it just go to one team and the team executes, etc., etc. Now, let's look at that a bit. So team structure, so this means creating a team structure according to wanted architecture. So that's in a nutshell what Conway's Law basically in all discussion. There's a much more to it, but I just want to simplify the discussion about Conway's Law. So if you have I don't know, some kind of a shop, and so there's the actual shop, and one or multiple teams are working on that and holding microservices. There's a product catalog, the sales and marketing, support. Okay, so there's all kinds of functions there and being done. So it seems good, right? So if anything related to support, it should be done here, etc., etc. Now the reality is simply that feature request quite often crosses that. Okay, so why is that? It's because of the nature of the customer need. Nature of the customer, the need is dynamic. While domain is rather static, so business domain. So we shouldn't conflate the actual customer need with the domain within which they operate. It doesn't necessarily follow what you actually wanted to follow. Besides that problem, you also have that there are shared components inevitably. So this is a typical example that I've counted several times. Teams supposed to be independent teams and dealing with the customer-facing stuff, and they're owning the components, etc. But then two teams depend on a core banking, let's say, typical example. And so there is a need to then create a core banking component team, which is going to take care of any changes to core banking related to the other that are required in the features done by other teams. And so you end up with a dependency between them. And the result is essentially that you now have three component teams. None of them is actually fully customer-centric anymore. Why? Because any change that comes here that requires a change in core banking will have to wait on each other with dependencies and blah, 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 blah. Yeah, so you end up with the same problem again. So, so dependencies in general lead to very high cognitive load. That's something to kind of keep in mind. So the more narrow the ownership is, the number of teams owning a shared component that depend on other teams is also going up. Okay, so and number of dependencies between teams due to changes shared components goes up, and this means delays and context switching between different teams. Because imagine you are working on a front end side, and then you depend on core banking being changed. And so you're working on that, you cannot finish. So what you say, we finished our part, and now we need to communicate with the component team that they need to do their part. Component team is actually, core banking team is working on something else in the meantime. So they need to pause that or have a meeting, which is context switching. And they need to coordinate with you, and then they say, okay, let us plan this in the next sprint. Oh, we need to wait for another sprint, and so why the heck so long? And so, are you done once they start doing it? No, we're not done yet. How come? Can somebody start chasing them? And it just never ends. It's a cognitive load goes up and up between all this kind of a chasing and doing all this work. API changes become very expensive. That's another thing. So it's supposedly you just need to talk to each other through APIs, they say, these teams. So if you align everything and teams don't need to talk to each other, they just need to define APIs. The problem is that whenever you have a change in API, it requires testing. It requires there's issues to that where there is same basically context switching and so on. So I don't want to explain this too much in detail. So if needed, I can based on the questions that you might have. Okay. So also what happens is because it's so painful to actually change APIs and manage that and etc. So what people do is teams actually start to adopt workarounds. So they implement the wrappers and all kinds of ugliness because it's so painful to coordinate with other teams. They want to be independent, but independence leads to all kinds of ugliness to make sure that you actually get stuff done in order to reduce the cognitive load. Okay, interesting. The reason why people do that when they say it's so cumbersome, what they mean is actually it's just straining them as a team in dealing with other teams and in order to get it done properly, so they choose a shortcut to actually do it. Now, how do you overcome this? What do you do? I'll kind of explain through the pictures already. You need to expand the ownership of each team. So how to overcome and how to reduce the cognitive load is expand the ownership, where the teams are sharing ownership between each other. Okay, so each team works from the whole product point of view. Each team can work on any component. Okay, so each team works on the most important all the time. So they're sharing also the same priority. And then you have exactly turned around dynamic. And so where you then ironically reduces the cognitive load. Okay. So, but that begs the question, if you do that, if you start sharing the ownership between teams, isn't actually shared ownership even worse? Isn't actually going to be putting a higher cognitive load? Because suddenly you need to actually work with other teams technically to ensure that the things are done in a good way and quality is maintained and so on. Yes, that's true. So if you actually enlarge the scope of ownership per team, cognitive load is going to go up. But then also incentive to find ways to reduce it goes up. Okay, so what do we mean by that? It means that you start improving code readability, safety nets, automation of testing, cross-team collaboration. You need to find the more effective ways. So instead of reducing a dependence on other team, you actually want to collaborate with other teams more and more. So it's a completely opposite dynamic. And you're then looking for the ways to actually optimize that in order to reduce the cognitive load. Okay. So it's a completely different way of actually looking than in a product development setup. So another one is if you have a narrow ownership, so this leads to technical specialization. A number of people capable to change or maintain a component is going down. And so amount of knowledge bottlenecks and risks is also going up then. And so which leads to effort to urgently acquire knowledge, ironically, because you don't have enough people. So suddenly you're being, people are out of necessity thrown into a problem, but they don't know anything about the component. So they are typically in a banking, what happens, somebody develops a component somewhere, and then they send it to another team and say, you need to deploy it in this region also. And so just do it. And a team is stuck with a code, which is just unworkable. They don't know anything about it, etc. And so this leads to a huge cognitive load. I've seen this really a lot in international banks, so in a very large banks. And so they struggle a lot with that. And this leads to ability to deliver timely and with quality, straining that a lot, essentially. So if you share ownership, you basically have more people who are capable of dealing with the software. And so this reduces the need to actually throw over the wall software to somebody else and have them actually maintain it. Too many meetings problem, I mentioned briefly. The narrower the ownership, the more coordination on top of structure is needed. The amount of coordinators, coordination roles, and levels of coordination are required. This means number of meetings, handovers, and other ways to actually do that increases. So you could say, but since you have all those coordinators, this means that the developers don't need to be involved. Well, no, they are still involved, because the problem is that the coordinators don't have the hands-on knowledge of what actually should be coordinated. So they depend still on the people in the teams to actually participate in this coordination process. But then they actually kind of like talking to a messenger instead of talking to each other. And so which is on its own cause of cognitive load. Yeah. Questions? I have a lot of time left, I think, right? So more than half an hour. I would love to have your questions. What's the role of a product owner and Scrum in this process? Yeah, Let me see. I'm gonna, I think, open up this picture. So it's a good question. And so in the story that I explained, if you have the narrow ownership, this also typically goes together with having a product owner per team situation. And then each team is called a Scrum team, which means that each team has their own kind of like a Scrum Master, and each team has a product owner. And if the ownership expands, so it means that overlaps with other teams, it also goes along with a situation where where you have a single product owner for multiple teams. So which is essentially still Scrum. And yeah, and so this means that a number of product owners that you need reduces. And so also the whole emphasis on Scrum reduces essentially quite heavily. So does it mean that you don't have Scrum anymore? No, actually, I think you're getting to a better form of a Scrum where there is not anymore so much emphasis on Scrum, but actually getting the benefit from the idea behind Scrum, where the teams simply collaborate. So to put it from a practical point of view, what I observe, in a situations where teams are sharing the same product owner, as is in this picture, for example, so you can have up to 8 teams sharing the same product owner. So one product owner prioritizes basically for 8 teams. The teams are basically engaged in way more activities themselves. They do refinement. They figure out what needs to be done. They coordinate between themselves, etc., etc. And so they engage with the customer also because there's only one product owner. Product owner cannot do it for you, and that leads to a situation where the teams don't talk about Scrum anymore. Actually, while they kind of are still doing Scrum, they just don't really talk about it. Yeah, I'm not sure if I answered that question. Scrum is more of the framework. Scrum is more of the. I don't understand the question yet. So another thing is, James may be typing another question. So kind of to continue on that is the opposite structure of and the problems of what I typically observe. So the problems that are typically then described is a very complex structure that starts to exist due to limited ownership per team. And so opposite of that, when ownership is overlapping between teams, this leads to a reduction of complexity organizationally. So you have less layers, less roles, less people in special roles, and less distance between teams and a customer. And so this is then the opposite of that. And ironically, this leads to less cognitive load. That's the surprising things maybe for the common sense. So go back to the beginning of what I explained. The common sense thinking tells us if the teams have more responsibility, if they are engaging directly with the customer, they will be strained, they will be overloaded. But the thing is that because of the dynamic what I just explained, exactly opposite happens, because now you don't have that context switching, etc. So because they are fully autonomous and they are not at the mercy of all kinds of requests from different stakeholders. They basically pick up for the most important from the backlog thing, and they're able to execute. And the way they execute, they are fully autonomous in that. Yeah, scaled agile PIs and multiple release trains appear to me a need in this environment. In this environment, I guess you mean in the complex environment, right? Yes. So if that's correct. So I mean, I'm obviously a certified LESS trainer, and but I don't engage in a bashing frameworks and stuff. I think it's really pointless discussions. So I think it's way more useful to understand where the needs come from and what's actually happening behind. And so I fully understand that if you have a complex environment and with a component, etc., that you have to have structure on top of it. And a typical structure is the PIs and release trains and things like scaled agile. That's why it's so popular, because by far the most organizations have these very complex structures, and that I just explained, the whole dynamic. Yeah, what's missing in organizations and also agile community and coaching community is a lack of this deeper realization where this need comes from and what's actually happening. And so I would, that's a pity that we don't talk about enough about the systemic effects of where this need comes from. Yeah, because at the end of the day, do you get a real agility with the PIs and scaled agile? I mean, nobody really claims that seriously because you end up with the PI planning delivering every 3 months. That can't be called really agile. Yeah. But it's a practical solution for problems for many companies. Yeah. So no one does it exactly per the frameworks. It all becomes somewhat hybrid. Yeah, that's true. Yeah, that's true. So it's also, having said that, there are patterns. I mean, whether it's a SAFe or some other framework. I mean, I mentioned the one which is kind of like looks a Spotify type of a thing. There isn't really fundamentally the pattern is the same. So if you have a narrow ownership, you end up with the structures on top. So and typically an organization, how it looks like, it's looks from my observation experience is they have a SAFe elements, but they have the Spotify elements, so they kind of combine the two. This is the most common situation. So they have these chapters and guilds and all this stuff, and on top of that they have a kind of like a big room plannings and called PI planning and etc. Yeah, correct. But then you have also companies which I'm then always involved with, is when I engage with them, they basically the conversation starts with on this level. Would you like to have something different than same of the same? So something different is a completely opposite pattern, which actually says simplify the hell out of it, and we need to do organizational change. And so how fast you simplify, that's a different discussion. But do you want to actually go in a direction of simplifying? And if you want to, this is actually this kind of a dynamic, and understanding this dynamic is really important. And and what it does to the people. And with increased responsibilities, does it mean that the Scrum team members, apart from the product owner, are empowered to understand requirements and define the user stories and acceptance criteria? Yes. So in teams which have increased responsibility, and obviously if you have one product owner for multiple teams, the product owner cannot, on behalf of the team, understand requirements and define user stories and acceptance criteria. The teams do that directly with the stakeholders and the users. So second part, this would be useful for cases where the PO is extremely overwhelmed, but it may take time away from the engineers to build. It may take time for engineers to build. So the assumption behind this one is that the job of engineers is to build. And so the engineers are hired to build stuff. No, engineers are hired to solve customer problem. That's what engineering is for. And but it's a very good point that you actually make still, because the fact is that a lot of engineers are actually somehow in education or somewhere have this assumption. You could possibly say majority of engineers have this assumption that their job is just building and not solving customer problem. And I think it's actually a bit scary for them when it comes to career development, because with the development of AI and everything, this is just going to be more and more obvious that the job of engineer is not to build. Build will be automated, and the engineer job will be actually to figure out which problem to solve. And that's actually the difficult part, and collaborate. Actually, there's a very good argument to say that in a software development, engineering is a social activity predominantly. So the good engineers are going to be in the future ones that you actually can socialize really well with other people. Yeah. And just to finish the Adrian note, and would this create a conflict of interest and take decision making away from the PO? No, because in generally the product owner decides still the priority. What engineers do is they figure out actually how to execute about that priority. So how does user story look like, requirements look like, etc. This is more on basically what needs to be delivered, but exactly in terms of how does a feature look like. But priority is still decided by product owner. So you need to distinguish between priority and the details of how to execute on a priority. Okay, now Jasmine mentions if we were to place it side by side with SAFe, probably that role similar with product managers, is it not? No, no. No, it's not similar. So because I know a product manager role in a SAFe, because of a structure of the SAFe, product managers still have a limited responsibility. So there is outside of SAFe context many companies have a head of product, okay, so or a chief product owner or something like that. That's what it corresponds to. Is somebody who's basically looking at a much broader scope of all the capabilities, and that person has a really high authority and can decide what's a real priority across multiple capabilities. Yeah. Need to understand the actual. So James says need to understand the actual requirements and talk to the customers in a non-technical manner. Yeah, that's correct, and that's a challenge. It takes time. And so we have a whole range of practices and education, and so to emphasize that, and that's a challenge because too many engineers don't have that skill yet. And yeah, so that takes time, and so typically also if you have a contract game, so meaning in many organizations contract game becomes quite toxic, so there is also that dimension which makes it difficult often, and meaning that it's not only they're unskilled, but they are literally afraid, and the business also is kind of doesn't want to talk to them even, and so that makes it even more difficult. So yeah, it's not easy. But I don't. It's still, even given that and a difficulty to resolve that, accepting that and then trying to kind of avoid that problem by introducing bureaucracy and processes and stuff. I don't think that's an option. So I would still rather spend effort to resolve the toxic situation, because accepting the toxic situation and then just managing it is not an option for any company, to my experience. Yeah. And in any case, you can. This book is, by the way, free of charge. So cognitive load. So basically explains quite a lot. Thank you, James. And by the way, I almost forgot to mention is this session is organized by Agilemania, as you can see. I've been working with them for ages now, and so started working in India a long time ago with Naveen, and organized the trainings there in India, and so less trainings, and now in Malaysia, and which they organized, and I will be providing a training in Kuala Lumpur soon. And so especially if you are in Malaysia, obviously, but also close to Malaysia, you could actually come and participate in the trainings. And but there is also not only me, by the way, providing this less training. There is in pretty much all over the world now, and so those trainings are being provided. Yeah, which go obviously much deeper into this topic and in this organizational change and how to make it happen. Yeah. So one thing I wanted to say is that nowadays it's very popular to kind of bash at frameworks and frameworks this, frameworks that, and suck. So less is seen as another framework, but it's actually not a framework. It's a basically organizational system. And so the framework part is practically irrelevant, almost irrelevant. So there isn't much of a framework to it. And it's all about actually how to simplify organization. It's an organizational system, essentially. And that's kind of like apples and oranges with agile frameworks. So also you could hardly call it agile framework. It obviously improves agility, but because of the emphasis on organizational system aspect, you could easily argue it's not an actual agile framework. And so it's really focusing on how to simplify organization. And the difference is that we believe that there isn't really agility without the pain of changing the organization. So way too many organizations are trying to overlay the agility on top of your existing structure. It just doesn't lead to anything useful. And the more complex organization it is, the less useful it becomes. So hence you have this massive amount of failed transformations because people overlay over the existing structure and then expect some kind of a miracle. It just doesn't happen. Yeah. Okay, then if not, feel free to contact us, Agilemania or me, up to you. And any questions about it. They also have a coaches and they can help you, assist you. You are in Malaysia, in Kuala Lumpur. And so this event was also mainly meant for Malaysia audience. I guess most of from there. And so yeah, I'm gonna be soon there. I'm really looking forward to going there and hopefully meet some of you. So see you in person. Thank you.
Okay, good. Thank you, everyone.